Hello, this is J. Mike Perkins, and welcome to Reviews from the Bad Movie Channel, where I take a serious look at some seriously bad films that were made to be taken seriously, but are inept to the point where they're so bad, they're good. And on this episode, one of the all-time classic bad films, that epic about the giant robotic carpet monster from outer space that eats people, The Creeping Terror. I'm going to cover this in 4 sections: background, director and cast, plot summary, and finally, 5 reasons why this film is bad. If you enjoy this video, please help my channel by hitting like and subscribe. The Creeping Terror had a very limited theatrical release in 1964. However, after the director died in 1975, the film was sold to television syndication, and beginning in the late 1970s, that film was on TV a lot, usually in the middle of the night. That's how people saw it, and that's how it gained its infamous reputation. What some people don't realize is if you turned on your local television station in the middle of the night back in the 70s and up through the 1980s, and in some cases until the very early 1990s, odds are you would not see these 30-minute long infomercials that you see today. Instead, you would see bad films, things like The Creeping Terror. And the reason was, back in the 80s, prior to the deregulation of television, most local stations, not all, but most, had a policy in place that would limit the amount of commercials that they would show in every hour to about 16 minutes. So if the station was going to make any money at all staying on the air in the middle of the night, they had to find the cheapest programming possible to fill up the other 44 minutes of airtime. And in most cases, the cheapest programming possible were bad films, things like The Creeping Terror. The Creeping Terror was shot at the Spawn Movie Ranch, adjacent to Los Angeles. The Spawn Ranch was owned by George Spawn, and it was a very pretty, if somewhat rugged, piece of property that was located on a mountain pass near an old stagecoach route. Back in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the Spawn Ranch was one of these places like the Bronson Canyon Caves in Griffith Park or the Vasquez Rocks located outside of LA that was used as a filming location for countless movies, television programs, commercials, etc. In addition to being an outdoor filming location, the Spawn Ranch had a horseback riding rental business on it. If you lived in Los Angeles and you wanted to ride a horse, you could come out to the Spawn Ranch, rent one, and then ride it on the various trails they had on their property. The Spawn Ranch did have one outdoor western set here, and that was used occasionally. But most people that rented the Spawn Ranch for filming did so because of some of the spectacular backdrops like this. You could use this from anything from a western to the landscape of an alien planet. Because the Spawn Ranch was full of these horseback riding trails, and because of the horseback riding rental business, it was a natural place to film westerns. And there were a lot of westerns shot at the Spawn Ranch, including most episodes of the Lone Ranger television program, and there are multiple episodes of Bonanza that feature footage shot at the Spawn Ranch. However, the Spawn Ranch was about way more than just westerns. For example, the famous cult film director Al Adamson, over a period of about 3 to 3.5 years, starting in 1968, shot an incredible 5 feature films at the Spawn Ranch. 3 of them were biker movies: Satan's Sadist, Hell's Bloody Devils, and Angel's Wild Women. The 4th one was about a girl gang that ran drugs called the Female Bunch. And the 5th one was an adult-themed Western, Lash of Lust. In 1968, some hippies showed up at the Spahn Ranch, and they negotiated an agreement with Mr. Spahn that would allow them to live there rent-free in exchange for work. The men were supposed to help out with the horseback riding rental business, and the women would help take care of Mr. Spahn, who was getting older and having trouble with his eyesight. Unfortunately, this didn't work out well, because the group of hippies ended up being the Charles Manson family. They were actually arrested at the Spahn Ranch after their murder spree. As you might imagine, after the Manson debacle, Mr. Spahn decided to sell the ranch. It lived on for a couple of years under new ownership, but it was eventually acquired by the state of California and is now part of the Santa Susana Pass State Historic Park. The buildings that were on the Spahn Ranch burned down a long time ago in a California wildfire, but the physical features of the property remain, including the famous Manson Cave, where the family would meet to plan out their murder spree. And today, the Manson Cave is a popular, if somewhat macabre, tourist attraction. And there are plenty of videos that'll tell you exactly how to get there once you get to the park. There's a scene in The Creeping Terror where Gramps, played by Jack King, is fishing. And although it's partially obscured here by this tree, directly behind Jack King is the famous Manson Cave. The Creeping Terror was directed by this guy, Arthur Nelson White. He directs the film under the name A.J. Nelson, and he stars in the film under the name Vic Savage. And unfortunately, for bad film fans everywhere, this is the only movie that Mr. White directed. There are no famous actors in The Creeping Terror, but there are a few people of note. One is William Thirlby, who plays the government's extraterrestrial expert, Dr. Bradford. Thirlby did have an acting career, but he is most famous as the original Marlboro Man, beginning in the 1954 print advertising campaign. Then there's Burt Holland. Holland had a very limited acting career, but he was a well-known makeup artist in Hollywood. And then there is Jack King. King is in a number of exploitation films in the late 1960s and 1970s, including two projects associated with the famous cult film director Ed Wood Jr. The first is King is in a movie that Ed Wood wrote the screenplay for called 1 Million AC/DC. And then King is in a movie that Ed Wood acts in from 1970 called Mrs. Stone's Thing. Wood plays himself, an alcoholic transvestite, and King has a memorable romantic scene on a pool table. The Creeping Terror begins with stock footage of a U.S. Atlas missile taking off that's run in reverse, which is supposed to symbolize the ship landing. Inside the alien spaceship are two carpet monsters. The first one leaves immediately. The second one remains in this sort of harness on the ship. The sheriff calls in the federal government. The government sends out an incredibly incompetent military unit, led by this guy to the right, a Colonel Caldwell. The government also sends in its leading expert on communicating with extraterrestrials, a Dr. Bradford. The monster that escaped then goes on a killing spree. First, it eats these two people in the park, but of course that's not enough, so it goes after this woman who's hanging up clothes on her clothesline and eats her. Then it goes after Gramps, played by Jack King, and his grandson Bobby, and eats them. You would think the monster might be full after eating Jack King, but no. Next it goes after this musician in the park who channels his own inner Pete Townsend on the monster, but that doesn't help. Then the monster eats the musician's audience. Then the monster goes to the dance. Of course, the monster terrifies people, and then, in order for the monster to eat everybody in the most efficient manner possible, they all go and stand in the corner so the monster can eat them one by one. Next, the monster goes to Lover's Lane and eats these people. Then the monster causes further havoc by knocking over this old car and eating the person inside. Next is the big showdown between the monster and the military. Well, the military doesn't do so good. Colonel Caldwell, after falling down here, remembers that the military has these things called hand grenades. So he throws one of those at the monster, and sure enough, that kills it. Dr. Bradford is then looking at the remains in the monster and realizes that the monster is full of a bunch of transistors and wires and things. So he first falls down, then gets into the military's truck and realizes he has to get back to the spaceship right away because the monsters are going to transmit their information about Earth to outer space. And he wants to stop it. Well, somehow he causes an explosion inside the spaceship, and that gravely wounds him, and he's coming out here in bad condition. But at the same time, what the explosion did is it released the other monster, and the other monster gets to eat a few more military people, and then it is destroyed by a 1957 Ford Custom. Then Dr. Bradford, in his dying moments, said he was not able to stop the robot monsters from transmitting their information about Earth into outer space, so we're all screwed. The end. And now, 5 reasons why this film is bad. Reason number 1 why this film is bad has got to be the monster itself. It's certainly one of the worst monsters ever in a film that was made to be taken seriously. The monster appears to be made out of some sort of tarp-like material, with a bunch of carpet remnants and other things like that that have been stuck to it. The monster's got this head with a bunch of hoses on it. The monster doesn't move very fast, so if you're going to be a victim, you have to do 2 things. The first is sit perfectly still, and then you have to help the monster eat you by pulling yourself into it. The second reason why this film is bad is it has almost no dialogue in it. Instead, a narrator tells you what people are saying.
Later that day, while they were awaiting the arrival of Dr. Bradford, Martin instructed Barney, on advice from Colonel Caldwell, to plant in the local papers the news that Ben and Jeff had taken off on a fishing trip to British Columbia. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Bradford arrived. He was a much younger man than one would imagine him to be.
Reason number 3 why this film is bad is the ridiculous and out-of-place lecture the narrator gives us on romantic relationships.
Barney and Martin had been bachelor buddies for years, but now that Martin was settling down to marriage, they were slowly drifting apart. Barney, naturally, was still dating all the girls in town, and he couldn't understand why Brett and Martin didn't pal around with him more than they did. He couldn't comprehend that married life brought with it not only new problems and duties, but the necessary togetherness of husband and wife as well. Since time began, this change in relationship has probably happened to all buddies in similar circumstances. Life has its way of making boys grow up.
Reason number 4, The Creeping Terror has some of the stupidest victims ever. As I mentioned before, you have to sit completely still to be eaten by the monster, and then you have to pull yourself into it. Well, what do you do if you're a big group of people like here in the dance hall to make it as easy as possible for the monster to eat you? Well, you gather together in a group in the corner. Now, there is this one guy that's going to leap over a table, but otherwise, you get there in the corner and you sit and you wait for the monster to eat you. Reason number 5 is the monster-eating women scenes are used to sex up the film. I mean, I've got to give the director of this movie some credit for creativity. How do you spice up a film about a giant robotic carpet monster from outer space that eats people? I'm sure after hearing this review, you're going to want to see this film in its entirety. So I put a link to that in the description of this video. Please check back with the channel for more reviews of classic bad films. And if you've enjoyed this video, please help me by hitting like and subscribe. This is J. Mike Perkins.